Why? Hang on 1 second. Trying to get my control panel working here. It would like to. There we go. Okay, cool. Well, without any further delay, oh boy. Okay. I think we're live, folks. I think we're good. I think the dang thing is happening. I'm going to put this mic over to the side here. Hopefully you can hear me just fine. Hopefully you can see me just fine. Maybe I'll scoot. Yeah, just a little bit like that. Get myself a little bit more in frame here. Hello, folks. What is going on? Thank you so much for joining me here on this glorious, glorious Monday. It is the Monday before Christmas. So if you're a celebrator of Christmas, Merry Christmas to you. Happy holidays to the rest of everybody else who doesn't celebrate. And if you don't celebrate any holidays, during this time of year, which, there are some people who don't, then just have a great winter, I suppose. Today we are talking, this is a show called What You Readin' For, and it is a live stream series that I do here on my YouTube channel where I talk about various books that I've read, and hope that you guys are able to join in for some of those convos. And today we're going to be talking about a book called Where Men Win Glory by Jon Krakauer. Wanted to let you guys know that the next book that we're going to be reading is The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. So I'm hoping the way it's going, I mean, I think I'm like 30 pages in to a 1,300 page novel. I think it's it might not be until like February or March that I'm done with this book, but you never know. I might just fly through some of it. Who knows? Who really knows? But I wanted to let you guys know the next book that we're going to be talking about so that you have an opportunity to read it or prepare for it in whatever way you see fit before that time comes. Before I go any further, let me pull up some notes because I actually did take a few notes here on this particular book. This was a very interesting read, guys. Longtime fans of this series will remember that the first episode of this series was on a book called Under the Banner of Heaven, which is by this same author, Jon Krakauer. And I liked that book quite a bit. It's one of my favorite books, honestly. Maybe in my top 20, maybe my top 10. And so I kind of fell in love with Krakauer's writing and decided to kind of look into other things that he's written. I'm going to lower this just a little bit more. Decided to look into some of the other stuff that he's written. He has written not like an insane amount of books, but the ones that he has written are pretty highly regarded. He's written such things as Into Thin Air, which is an account of a climb that he did up Mount Everest, if I'm not mistaken. I try to go into books with very little information, or as little information as I can kind of get away with before reading, to kind of let the book expose itself to me, for lack of a better turn of phrase. So I purposely have kind of not looked up too much about his books because I kind of want to just read them to get the gist of what they have to say on their own. So he has Into Thin Air. He also has Into the Wild, which was a pretty acclaimed book. I think it might be his most famous work, if I'm not mistaken. Was turned into a movie and everything. He also wrote his most recent book, if I'm not mistaken, is Missoula, which is again, I don't need to recount like what the summary of books that I've never read. Just doesn't seem worthwhile. But the gist of what I'm trying to get at here is that he has a lot of books, or a few books, and they're all really good. And I plan on reading basically everything by him at some point or another. But this particular book, Under the Banner of Heaven, I found at a used bookstore for like $5. And the subject matter of this book is one that I didn't think I would be interested in. So I kind of was like, is this one of his books that I want to read? Again, since reading this, I have kind of decided I think I should read everything by this guy because the amount of research and dedication that goes into each one of his, at least the two books that I've read, is pretty staggering. And I think that he presents information in a really interesting and compelling way. But at first, I was like, a story about, I think my impression of this book, kind of just going off of like what I read from the cover and the back of the book and stuff, I kind of was like a patriotic story about an NFL player who goes to fight in Afghanistan. While it might be interesting to read, I don't know that would be like the most, I don't think it would be a page turner for me. And boy, was I wrong. But yeah, just for larger context, I will be reading more of Krakauer's stuff, but this is our second in our kind of exploration of his works. He's largely a nonfiction writer. I don't know that he has written any widely published fiction, I don't think. So, yeah, we're diving into Where Men Win Glory today. So, what is this book about? Well, as I kind of described, it is a book largely centered around a gentleman by the name of Pat Tillman. There's a picture of him on the back of the book. Hopefully I can get it somewhat in focus there. Whatever, you can kind of see him. Buff dude, long hair, kind of a stern look on his face. One honestly might like take him for kind of a hippie if they were just sort of like looking at him at first glance. And Pat Tillman is a very interesting guy. And the book mostly is concerned with telling us about Pat Tillman, about his story, like where he came from, who he is, diving into his worldview. And it's also concerned with giving us the background and history of the reasons the United States invaded Afghanistan. And it does this because at a certain point, Pat Tillman, who is an NFL player, decides to join the army and go fight in Afghanistan. So let's just dive in a little bit here and talk a little bit about like the large, I guess the large scale kind of events of the book. We get kind of these contrasting chapters. For a while, it's kind of like chapter for chapter. We'll get like one chapter of Pat as a kid or a teenager, and then one chapter that takes place in Afghanistan at around the same time as Pat would have been like a teenager. So we get a lot of the context of, you know, the Soviet Union and the United States kind of fighting a proxy war in Afghanistan, like both sides kind of propping up various groups in Afghanistan to further their interests in the Middle East. And eventually the United States kind of wins that proxy war, and the kind of large snafu that becomes the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, and their kind of loss, I guess, in that regard, ends up being one of the large contributing factors to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The impression that I get of that time, because I wasn't alive when it happened, my impression is that it was kind of a confluence of the war in Afghanistan being a massive failure on the Soviet Union's part, the explosion of Chernobyl, or the nuclear meltdown of Chernobyl, and kind of mounting pressure from the West to kind of further privatize the markets of the Soviet Union. The Berlin Wall coming down, like all of these factors kind of came together in order to make the Soviet Union fall, more or less. Obviously, there's like with a lot of things in history, there's a myriad of reasons why something like this happens. But definitely the, Chernobyl and Afghanistan, I think, were two very significant contributing factors to the Soviet Union falling. And so from there, we kind of zoom out a little bit and talk about the various groups in Afghanistan, the Mujahideen, the various Afghan forces. Let me look here. I just want to make sure I don't, because Krakauer describes at one point that the kind of I want to get this right, because I don't want to kind of offend anybody. Oh gosh, this is taking so long. I'm sorry. I don't mean to hold up the episode entirely, but I think this is important to get right. Basically, that like there is, I believe Afghan is the more or less accepted term to describe people from Afghanistan. Afghani, I believe, is a kind of I think it's largely kind of a demeaning term given by the U.S. military to I'm almost certain that Afghan is the kind of correct term. Afghani is like kind of somewhat racist, I believe. Haji is also a term that is used several times through the book, and I believe that is also considered fairly offensive. So I believe it's Afghan. So several kind of groups are vying for the control of Afghanistan and its various resources, its various cities, kind of various warlords, which another, from what I gather, is another term that has been kind of utilized to describe like religious leaders in Afghanistan who are in control of various kind of rural fighting forces, and they're described as warlords in the book. I don't. I think I'll just be using that term maybe once or twice because that's just the way that they're described, and I don't mean any offense by that in particular. I think it's just one of those things that's kind of unclear, I guess, like what the proper termage would be there for these people who have control over rural fighting forces in Afghanistan. So, Afghanistan becomes the center of a hugely, hugely violent and bloody and horrific civil war, more or less as a result of the U.S. and the USSR interfering in that area, basically through the funding of these various sides and the arming of various groups. The war becomes very messy and very like the violence escalates quite a bit to where like entire city blocks are just being decimated by these these forces that are kind of vying for power. And at the same time, a huge amount of young men in the area, largely young men, and these men are from kind of all over the Middle East: Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, a bunch of countries in the area. A lot of young men are starting to become radicalized by the violence. They are kind of, and again, my history here is and religious knowledge is not the best, so I'll be describing it as my understanding is, such as it is. That they kind of like reform Islam a little bit. They reform the Islamic faith, and include a lot more sort of direct violence and direct. It's complicated to even kind of wrap your head around, because it's sort of like a pressure cooker that starts to cook people into radical extremists. And it's kind of hard to even fault them for becoming that, because of how much destruction has been wrought in the wake of U.S. imperialism and the imperialism of the Soviet Union. So much death and horror has been kind of brought to these people that they start to utilize their faith and their sort of nihilism, I guess, is a good way to put it. Like their wish for everything to kind of just be reduced to rubble because of their their horror at what is taking place. It just starts to make people seek out violent ways in which to retaliate against largely the United States. The book kind of centers around terrorist attacks in the United States, because that's kind of the framing of the book. And so at the same time that all this is kind of going on, we're watching Pat Tillman as he is in the United States. He's living a very kind of privileged life as a high school football star. He falls in love with his who would become his wife, Marie. They, get married. He goes to college. They're kind of, they're like madly in love with each other. Pat eventually becomes kind of like, I wouldn't really call him like a star player in college. Like it's clear that like his potential is there, but through circumstances of like the NFL is kind of complicated, or not NFL, football and sports in general are kind of complicated in that like you could have the best player in the league on a kind of a team that's rather unlucky, or they aren't very skilled, or he's on a, the circumstances of like, well, he's a new guy, so he gets put on like a third string type thing, and they're, just things of that nature where it kind of, the circumstances create a reality where Pat Tillman is kind of undervalued as a player. And his team, I believe it's the ASU Sun Devils, if I'm not mistaken, they end up having like a pretty bad season. Or they have a pretty good season followed by a pretty bad season. But somebody from the Arizona Cardinals has faith in Pat, and Pat Tillman is recruited for the Cardinals. And my recollection of this part of the book is that the Cardinals don't do very well in the two. I think he's in the NFL for 2 seasons, maybe 3, and they don't do particularly well. But during this time, 9/11 happens. The attacks on September 11th. A terrorist attack is perpetrated on the World Trade Center in New York, and the country is the United States is kind of in shock at like this hugely horrifying event taking place. And this is kind of when we get a deeper view into Pat Tillman's kind of psychology as a person, in that, he's playing for the NFL, and many of the NFL players of the time are, of course, undergoing the same kind of patriotic fervor that the rest of the country is going through, which is kind of like, we should go to Afghanistan and just like bomb the shit out of everybody because they did the same thing to us. That's their kind of understanding of what's taking place. And Pat is somewhat disgusted by the fact that like his, the people that he's playing with, and a lot of people in the US are kind of caught in this fervor of like being very concerned with the violence that's taking place, but none of them are really like doing anything about it. And Pat is convinced that his part in all of this should be to go and join the army. And basically everyone tells him that is a horrible idea. And, it's a thing where he kind of gets, because, Pat Tillman is kind of like, he's a good old boy, right? Like he's a I want to say like down home, but he's not like from the South. He's from California, but he's very like, he was instilled with the values of like loyalty and honor and courage and like all these, virtuous kind of qualities. He's imbued with these, from his parents and from his experiences throughout life. He also gets sent to juvie at one point because of his loyalty and his kind of macho spirit. He gets in a fight and he like hospitalizes somebody and spends a little time in juvie. And, his time in juvie kind of reaffirms in him that like he wants to be a good person and he wants to right the wrongs of his past, more or less. But all this to say basically that like, because of these virtues that he's been instilled with, he thinks, well, why wouldn't I go fight? If my country is under attack, I am obligated to go and help defend it in whatever way he thinks is possible. And so he enlists, and he gets offered some like crazy contract because like again like at this time so much of the marketing that's taking place is basically being like, look at this honorable young man. Like it was kind of like a dual purpose marketing campaign both on the part of the NFL and the US Army of like driving up recruitment numbers by being like, look at this guy who gave up this like $6 million contract to come join the army, but then also sell ads for the NFL basically and just be like, you know, the NFL is the home of the, you know, the patriotic American spirit or whatever. And so Pat Tillman gets offered this huge contract, and he turns it down because, and, you know, as misguided as so many of the instincts and choices of Pat Tillman are to me, one can't help but look at a choice like that and think, at the very least, he is somebody who sticks to his principles. If his principles dictate that he is a person who doesn't go back on his word and is a person that it's also made a big deal is made of kind of pointing out that Pat Tillman is somebody who stands up to bullies. The portrayal of that, I think, is somewhat murky because I think Tillman in some ways is kind of a bully in and of himself, but he's someone who claims to stand up to bullies. Well, who's more of a bully than somebody who, you know, flies 2 planes or 3 planes? Yeah, because one hit the Pentagon. Anyway, you know, flies planes into buildings to kill people. So Pat Tillman feels like this kind of protector that he's going to go and fight in this war. So, Tillman becomes an Army Ranger through a huge amount of adversity. At first, he's not even sure he wants to do it because of his kind of... He's naturally kind of anti-authoritarian, although you know, someone who kind of respects the word of the U.S. government and goes to join the military, you would think, well, like, that's kind of submitting to authority in the most classic way, right? But his natural kind of anti-authoritarian streak makes him somewhat unpopular with the commanders of, you know, the kind of Ranger infantry. By the way, I'm probably getting a lot of the terminology incorrect. I'm not like a big scholar of military jargon, but he becomes a Ranger through much adversity. He gets a reputation as kind of like a very unique guy because of just who he is. He reads a lot and he writes a lot. He's very philosophical. He is not as it's weirdly like he is patriotic through virtue of what he does rather than direct kind of patriotism or kind of allegiance to the nation or the people or the government, right? He like becomes this patriotic warrior only through his own decisions and not necessarily because he feels any kind of special allegiance to the will of the government or anything. Let me take a peek at my notes here really quick. Let me take a peek here. There's a couple things that I wanted to read, see if Yeah, I'll go ahead and read this really quickly. This is it's a quote from the book, but in the book, Krakauer is quoting Hermann Goring from who was a very important Nazi, I guess you could say. He was one of Hitler's kind of commanding people. He I'll just read directly here. This is on page 249. Pat and Kevin. Kevin is Pat's brother, who also joins the Army Rangers. Pat and Kevin were familiar with the words of Hermann Goring, Hitler's Reichsmarshal, who in 1946, shortly before he was sentenced to death for crimes against humanity, notoriously observed, "Naturally, the common people don't want war. Neither in Russia, nor in England, nor in America, nor for that matter in Germany. That is understood. But after all, it's the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it's always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it's a democracy, a fascist dictatorship, or a parliament, or a communist dictatorship. Voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to greater danger. It works the same way in any country." And this is where my kind of perception of Krakauer as a writer and what he's trying to accomplish with this book kind of started to shift. Going into this book, I almost was kind of under the impression that Krakauer was going to write basically like a 350-page fluff piece on, on Pat Tillman and the military invading Afghanistan, and kind of puffing up and being like, kind of deifying Pat Tillman and saying what a hero he is or whatever. And I'm not here to kind of debate the hero worship of the U.S. military. I obviously have a lot of love in my heart for veterans and people who believed that they were, going into various conflicts to defend their fellow Americans. I have a lot of sort of internal respect for that instinct and those people. However, what Krakauer is doing by including this quote is basically saying that, like, he's kind of just like illustrating the internal conflict that maybe not internal conflict, maybe that's a wrong turn of phrase. He's illustrating basically the contradiction between someone's patriotic instinct to do the right thing, whatever that happens to be, but also being like, or kind of pointing out that, like, those people are still subject to the very things that we say are bad, or like the kind of instincts that we as Americans are taught to believe are bad, which is like just kind of doing whatever the government says. That is, a criticism of totalitarianism or dictatorship that we as a democracy levy against those who are in, dictatorships and whatnot, is like people who just follow orders, are often painted as kind of bad in some way. But we ourselves are still subject to that. And Pat Tillman, no matter how noble or honorable he or his instincts are, he is still part of this larger machine. And so I thought that was pretty interesting in that, like, oh, we're actually getting a full kind of fleshed out look at, like, the psychology behind somebody who joins the military during a time of kind of nationalistic fervor. So let's dive into like the meat of the book, the action of the book. So I guess to talk about this, I have to kind of preface it by saying that, and spoiler alert, you know, anybody who's not familiar with the story of Pat Tillman, or anybody who plans on reading the book, spoiler alert. Pat Tillman was killed in action, and he was killed in action through friendly fire. Like his fellow Rangers fired on him and killed him. There are various theories about whether or not the killing was intentional. You know, if maybe his the people in his unit had something out for him and decided to take him out. There are kind of conspiracy theories surrounding that. I won't be diving into them because I'm not an expert in any of this, and the evidence the book presents to me kind of spells out like it probably wasn't that. Like, friendly fire is a horrific, a tragic reality of war in the modern day, in any war actually. It going back to the, you know, back to ancient warfare. Like, the chaos of battle is so all-consuming that that directing fire and making sure that who you're shooting at is actually the enemy is often very difficult. Especially, you know, they're fighting out in the desert. There's sand being kicked up, dust everywhere. There, you know, the loud rumble of engines and trucks and gunfire, and you're also directed in the military often to look to your squad leader, and wherever your squad leader is firing, that's where you fire. Whether or not you're able to confirm that the target you're shooting at is actually an enemy combatant, you know, if you see your squad leader firing in a direction, you also fire in that direction. So, is it possible that his death was premeditated? I guess it's possible. I don't want to spend too much time speculating on that because it's impossible to say. I wasn't there. I didn't do the autopsy. Like, I'm just going by like what's in the book. So let me turn to a page here really quick. Yeah, so I'm going to read this little part here, and I'll hopefully it's not lacking too much context. Hopefully I can provide enough context to make the viewer or listener of this show appreciate what's being said here. And the overarching kind of message of what I'm reading is that oftentimes friendly fire and people being killed by friendly fire is obfuscated by the military and by the government. I'm reading from page 237. He uses the word fratricide, by the way, and fratricide is a soldier killing a allied soldier. If fratricide is an untoward but inevitable aspect of warfare, so too is the tendency by military commanders to sweep such tragedies under the rug. It's part of a larger pattern. The temptation among generals and politicians to control how the press portrays their military campaigns, which all too often leads them to misrepresent the truth in order to bolster public support for the war of the moment. The fact that the United States has used misinformation to promote the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan is not terribly surprising, therefore. What is alarming is the scale and sophistication of these recent propaganda efforts and the unabashedness of their executors. By the way, just for context, this book I think was written in like 2014. The conflict was still going on over there, and still kind of is. But this was written like 10 years ago, so the war was a little bit more kind of recent, I guess. Or the invasion, at least, was a little more recent. The Bush administration took the ruthless stratagems developed by Karl Rove to impugn its political opponents. Stratagems that relied heavily on managing public perception by means of deceit, and used them to promote the global war on terror, a name that was itself deliberately intended to help sell the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. In October of 2001, so this was the month after 9/11, the Department of Defense established the clandestine Office of Strategic Influence specifically to dupe international news organizations into running false stories that would build support for war. When the New York Times revealed the existence of this program in February 2002, public clamor forced Donald Rumsfeld to officially kill it. But in November of that year, he admitted during a press briefing without apology that he had killed it in name only. Continuing on to page 238 here. And this is a quote from Rumsfeld. And then there was the Office of Strategic Influence. You may recall that. And, oh my goodness gracious, isn't that terrible? Henny penny, the sky is going to fall. I went down that next day and said, fine, if you want to savage this thing, fine. I'll give you the corpse. There's the name. You could have the name. But I'm going to keep doing every single thing that needs to be done. And I have. I'll continue reading here. It is now widely understood that during the run-up to the war, the administration's White House Iraq group presented spurious intelligence as verified fact in order to bolster public support for the invasion. Much less attention has been paid to the administration's use of misinformation on an even grander scale to promote the war in the years following the invasion. In January 2003, the White House created the Office of Global Communications, a $200 million program to manipulate public opinion about the coming war. According to an article by James Bamford in the November 17, 2005 issue of Rolling Stone, as the war in Iraq has spiraled out of control, the Bush administration's covert propaganda campaign has intensified. According to a secret Pentagon report personally approved by Rumsfeld in October 2003 and obtained by Rolling Stone, the Strategic Command is authorized to engage in military deception, defined as presenting false information, images, or statements. Never before in history, Bamford observed, had such an extensive secret network been established to shape the entire world's perception of war. So this is what's insane to me, is that in the context of the modern age of information, it is so critical to those who want to perpetuate war and violence. It's so critical to them to manage how people view the war effort and the war itself, that they have spent all of this money and have essentially they have made it a common practice to basically just lie. They can lie as much as they want to in order to skew the public's perception of a war, to drive up recruitment numbers, to make things look not quite as bad as they are. That's why fratricide often gets covered up, is because, if people knew, if people knew how, like, and this is one of the reasons that I highly recommend reading this book if you're interested, because the amount of people that were killed in that war. Sorry, my phone is going crazy right now. Where was I? The true horror of what takes place on a battlefield, even between the people that are supposed to be on the same side. The amount of times that enemy ally helicopters are firing on troops on the ground because they don't know that it's the enemy, or it's not the enemy, rather. The amount of times that, just the absolute, like, Jeeps getting bogged down in the mud and then being fired upon by, friendly troops. Like, it's horrifying. And if the population knew that was taking place, or knew the extent to which it took place, they might be less gung-ho when it came to invading, when it came to enlisting, things of that nature. If they truly knew how awful it was, it might give people a second thought when it comes to, continuing the war effort. But because of the government's influence over this, they're able to obfuscate these facts and make them look different than they are. For instance, here's a great example from the book. There is a woman at one point, Jessica Lynch, I believe is her name. I could be getting the name wrong. I'm going to use the name Jessica Lynch because I don't remember, but I think that's who it is. This woman, Jessica Lynch, is an enlisted Army recruit, and her squad goes out to, I think they're trying to take control of, like, this specific city block in Syria, I think is the name of the city. But either way, there is a particular event that happens where Jessica Lynch, her squad, and another squad are caught kind of between fighting enemy troops, the Taliban, and fighting kind of each other because, again, this kind of mix-up of what actually takes place. A bunch of her squad gets killed, and she herself almost dies. But she doesn't almost die because of enemy fire. She almost dies because she crashes her vehicle. She ends up crashing her vehicle. By the way, some people, and I hesitate to say what I think of these people, but some people might think that my criticism of the U.S. military is in some way kind of insinuating that I dislike members of the military or veterans. Feel free to think whatever you want, but just know that. But my criticism comes from a place of just kind of an anti-war perspective, not necessarily anti-troop or anti-soldier. Just getting that out of the way. So Lynch gets taken prisoner by the Taliban. She is heavily wounded, and she gets taken to a hospital. all of the evidence suggests that while she was quote unquote prisoner and she was being cared for in this hospital, her captors were nothing but kind to her. And again, who knows if this is the truth? I'm just going by what's reported in the book. There is no, the government tries to spin it basically that like this woman was taken captive. She's a hero. She fired every single one of her bullets to try to save her squad, but she was taken captive. She got stabbed. She was raped while she was in captivity. And we're going to send the Army Rangers in there to go free her from that hospital and all this stuff. That's kind of the way they spun it. And, there were like news stories of like hero veteran, or hero soldier saved from Taliban forces or whatever. When in reality, her squad was under friendly fire and she crashed her vehicle, never got stabbed nor raped, and they were caring for her at the hospital because, she's an enemy troop, but like she's wounded, like, kind of the US military in essence kind of trying to paint Taliban forces like these animals, right? That like are mistreating our troops or over there or whatever. When that's so far from what actually happened. And again, this is just another example of like how they're able to lie in order to suit the needs of the moment in terms of driving up recruitment and manipulating public perception of the war effort. Let's see here. So here's what I want to focus on here for this next reading. The series of events that led to Pat Tillman dying were such that let me see if I can get the events here straight. Basically, what happens is a truck breaks down. These Army Rangers are driving towards they're driving towards Mana, which is a town that they're going to like observe or whatever. A truck breaks down, and then the commanding officer of the truck brigade calls in to headquarters and is like, hey, can we get a helicopter out here to lift this truck out of here? The commanding officers are basically like, no, we can't do that. Sorry. What you're going to have to do is try to get the truck somehow onto a paved road so that it can get towed out of here. And the paved road is like, I don't know, like 50 miles away or something like that. And there's kind of a miscommunication, or not even miscommunication, just the people on the ground are trying to communicate to command, this is really going to screw things up. We're trying to get to Mana before it gets dark. Kind of communicating to command that like, this idea that they have of like splitting the platoon in order to have one group go with the broken down truck and one group to go to Mana to, conduct their mission, is going to get people killed, like almost certainly. And, but I'll just read from here, and hopefully, once again, hopefully this makes sense without too much of the context. I'll try to provide context if it seems necessary. Uthlaut is as far as I remember, is like the leader of the platoon, and Dennis is his higher up, I believe. But I'll just read here, and this should hopefully illustrate kind of like the division between people on the ground who are actually fighting and their commanding officers who are sending them in to go die for the war effort, basically. And it should also help elucidate a little bit of how Tillman came to be in the position that he was when he died. This is page 284. After making his case that the mission could be accomplished just as effectively and just as quickly without splitting the platoon, Uthlau was baffled by headquarters' stubborn insistence on dividing it. He asked Dennis, "So the only reason that you want me to split my platoon is to have boots on the ground in the sector before dark?" "Yes," Dennis replied. Dismayed and frustrated, Uthlau nevertheless accepted that headquarters had spoken and that he had no choice but to follow orders. A moment later, Uthlau testified, "I then received a radio call on the same net, requesting detailed information about where the platoon would be splitting and what route each of the two elements would be traveling, so that A-10 Warthogs could be dispatched from Bagram to provide air support in the event of enemy contact. I handed the radio off to my forward observer," Uthlau said, "and told him to brief the air support on these routes. I then called all of my squad leaders and platoon sergeant to brief them on the plan. I told them who was assigned to each element. I showed my squad leaders and platoon sergeant the routes of both elements. I then informed them that my element had to move out because we had to be set up by nightfall north of Mana." During an investigation of Tillman's death 7 months later, Brigadier General Gary Jones asked Alpha Company First Sergeant Thomas Fuller, "I mean, what necessitated in this mission right here that they had to get down there so quickly?" "I don't think there was anything," Fuller testified under oath. "I think that a lot of times at higher headquarters, maybe even, higher than battalion headquarters, they may make a deadline, and then we just feel like we have to stick to that timeline. There's no intel driving it. There's no events driving it. It's just a timeline, and we feel like we have to stick with it, and that's what drives that kind of stuff." In other words, the sense of urgency attached to the mission came from little more than a bureaucratic fixation on meeting arbitrary deadlines so missions could be checked off a list and tallied as accomplished. This emphasis on quantification has always been a hallmark of the military, but it was carried to new heights of fatuity during Donald Rumsfeld's tenure at the Pentagon. Rumsfeld was obsessed with achieving positive metrics that could be wielded to demonstrate progress in the global war on terror, or the illusion thereof. So basically, again, in order to present the image that missions are being accomplished and little things are, chess pieces are being moved around the board, they split this platoon and it ends up in a cluster F that gets several people killed by friendly fire. And I won't dive into the specifics of the firefight where that happens because, honestly, it's very complicated. There's I think there's 5 chapters dedicated to just second by second the testimony of the people that were there of what was happening and how it all went down. Read the book if you want the blow by blow. But again, this is the overwhelming impression you get while reading this is this all could have been avoided if military command, the people who are giving the orders, had simply listened to the people that were actually there doing the fighting. Because again, you can't know. And this is what boggles my mind sometimes about people that are so kind of pro-war, pro-military, pro kind of gung-ho about, whatever the conflict is, and just being we should go invade them and whatever the case is. You hear this sometimes about about Israel, about Ukraine. Some people even suggested about Mexico and doing battle with the cartels or whatever. you truly like have no conception of what you're asking for. You have no your perception of what it's like to be in a firefight and the absolute chaos of battle. You just have no idea. And I don't either. Like, just to clarify, it's not like I've ever been, shot at. But from reading and kind of studying this stuff, you get the impression of like, no, this type of conflict is bad. And what it symbolizes is a breakdown in diplomacy. It symbolizes the inability of human beings to work together in a peaceful way, such, to the extent that people get put into the most unimaginably scary situations. Like, it sounds even silly coming out of my mouth. Like the absolute atrocities that take place because of the inability to form peaceful resolutions between world leaders. I'm kind of ranting a little bit. I guess that's sort of what this live stream series is, but nevertheless. What I'm trying to get at basically is that this particular screw up that gets Pat Tillman killed is downstream from the ineffectiveness of military leaders to communicate. I guess that's what I'll say about that. One more thing I want to read here. Okay. So yeah, this is after Tillman has been killed. And this is kind of talking about the way in which his death is handled by the White House. I'll just read here. This is from page 381. The president neglected to mention that 3 months earlier, as part of the investigation launched by Congress to finally and definitively get to the bottom of it, meaning the bottom of the Tillman death, Representative Waxman had sent a letter to the White House formally requesting all documents received or generated by any official in the Executive Office of the President, including the Communications Office and Office of Speechwriting, that relate to Corporal Tillman, and sent a similar request to the Department of Defense. The recipients responded by sending Waxman more than 30,000 pages of material, most of which were nothing more than press clippings about Tillman. Emails, memos, and other documents that might have shed light on the cover-up were conspicuously withheld. As Emmett T. Flood, special counsel to the president, explained, "We have not produced certain documents responsive to the committee's request because they implicate executive branch confidentiality interests." Despite praising Tillman's patriotism and courage at every opportunity, the White House in fact used every means at its disposal to obstruct the congressional investigation into Tillman's death and its aftermath. In a report issued in July 2008, Waxman's Oversight Committee noted, "The White House was intensely interested in the first reports of Tillman's death, sending or receiving some 200 emails concerning Tillman on the day following the tragedy. But after the army belatedly revealed to the American public that he was the victim of fratricide, the White House could not produce a single email or document relating to any discussion about Corporal Tillman's death by friendly fire. The intense interest that initially characterized the White House's and Defense Department's reaction to Corporal Tillman's death was followed by a stunning lack of curiosity about emerging reports of fratricide and an incomprehensible carelessness and incompetence in handling this sensitive information. Basically, once they knew that he died at the hands of his fellow soldiers, they stopped investigating or tried to make every effort to stop investigating. They lied to the family, to Pat Tillman's family. They lied to the American public, just being like, oh, what a hero, he died by enemy fire. And all the while they knew that he was almost certainly killed, later proven to be, but at the time almost certainly killed by friendly fire. And this, I think, is one of the grander themes of the book, is that, like, the government can do whatever they want. They can do whatever they want. They can lie about whatever they want. They can obfuscate the truth in any dimension that they feel fit. They can manufacture, weapons of mass destruction that don't exist in order to, justify invading Iraq. They can do whatever they want. They can do whatever they want. And it's really, really scary. And you often don't know about these things until years later, until full investigations have taken place. But this is after it would be useful to have any of this knowledge. And so my that was the last thing I wanted to read from this book. The message, the overall things that I took from this book are, number one, that Pat Tillman, although he was by all accounts mostly a good man, was not some kind of patriotic, well, he was patriotic. I guess what I'll say is this. Pat Tillman was a subject to the same machismo and patriotic fervor that his enemy combatants were. Basically, every radicalizing factor that could have gone into creating a terrorist, those were the same factors that created Pat Tillman. Loyalty to family, loyalty to nation, loyalty to a sense of faith, although Pat Tillman was an atheist, but just faith in kind of his internal spirit, and a sense of like having to do battle in order to defend himself and his nation. These same circumstances create terrorists, and they create the troops at home. And Pat Tillman was swept up in that, I guess you could say. So although Pat Tillman was a good man by every metric, he is the patriarchal drive to go and kill is something that lives within the dark heart of all men, I guess you could say. The other things that will be key takeaways from this book is that way more deaths in combat are due to friendly fire than I had previously known. And that is a huge calculation that I think will be part of my mental calculus when I'm thinking about pretty much any conflict going on around the world or that America gets involved in or anything. These are conflicts that almost always lead to people killing their own. If it wasn't already horrifying enough that they're killing people from other countries, we're all human when it comes to the end of the line there. So that's, I think, always an important thing to keep in mind. And the other thing is that just always try to take anything said or revealed by the government with a grain of salt. And with the Epstein files apparently being released and being heavily redacted, I don't think that's ever been more important to keep in mind. The government does whatever they want, and they say whatever they want. This is a fantastic book. It has solidified Krakauer as one of my favorite authors, probably in my top 5. This, I think, goes somewhere in the top 20 books I've ever read. Great, great book. I highly recommend reading it. Thank you so much for watching. Please make sure to like the stream. Make sure to subscribe if you want to see more of these. Comment. Let me know what you think of John Krakauer, Where Men Win Glory, what you think of the Pat Tillman story, suggestions for what to read next. And make sure to read The Way of Kings, if you haven't already, in preparation for the next episode of this live stream series. I love you all. Have a happy holiday season. Merry Christmas. A warm winter, I suppose. Thank you for watching. I will see you guys